All right, so I'm Craig Hefner. This talk is obviously exploiting surveillance cameras like a Hollywood hacker. Now, as some of you may or may not know, when my talk was first announced, it got a little bit of press, which as a speaker is really cool. The problem is that in order to hype their articles, all of the news stories who covered my talk decided to emphasize the fact that I used to work for a particular three-letter agency who has been in the press quite a bit themselves lately. And although they couldn't quite seem to agree what those three letters actually stood for, some of them did go as far as to claim that what I was presenting at Black Hat was actually work I had done for said agency. Now, with current events being what they are, this resulted in some very interesting phone calls from my ex-employer. Yeah. Luckily, we have people who handle the phones for me, and they got yelled at instead of me. But while my initial attempts to kind of assuage their fears didn't work, I was eventually able to convince them that yes, sometimes people on the internet are wrong. So, just to be very clear, this talk is not about any work that I've ever done for any ex-employer. What this talk is about is work that I do for my current employer. I work as an embedded vulnerability analyst for Tactical Network Solutions. I also teach our embedded device exploitation courses and dabble with wireless hacking from time to time as well. What I'm going to be talking about today, obviously, is the security in surveillance cameras, or lack thereof, as it may be. Back in early 2011, last year, I started taking a look at the security that's in the firmware actually running on these network-connected surveillance cameras. And since I'm up here talking about it, as you might surmise, I found a lot of interesting things. So I'll be dropping some O-days as well as some not-so-O-days, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But also demonstrating how these vulnerabilities ultimately can be leveraged in true Hollywood-style fashion. So when I started looking at surveillance cameras, I said, well, I've looked at a lot of embedded devices before, but I haven't looked at surveillance cameras. So I kind of wanted to start off with something easy, something that would be almost guaranteed to get me a win. So I picked D-Link, because they never fail to disappoint. Specifically, I looked at the DCS 7410, which at around $900 is one of their more expensive business IP cameras. And like all the cameras that I'm going to be talking about today, they provide an administrative interface as well as access to the video feed through a web server running on the camera. Which makes the web server a very attractive target for an attacker. Now specifically, this camera uses Leidy, which is an open source web server that you find used quite a bit in embedded devices. And they actually, in the Leidy configuration, they set up some very sane and restrictive access rules as to who can get to what through the web server. So you can see here that if you wanted to get to anything in the CGI admin directory, you have to be logged in as an admin. If you want to get to anything in the video directory, you can be any user, but you do have to be authenticated. You do have to be a valid user. So they had entries for every single directory in their web interface, except one. They did not have an entry for CGI bin. Now, as it turns out, there's not much in the CGI bin directory. Almost all of the CGI scripts are actually in the CGI directory, which is protected. In fact, CGI bin only has one file in it, and that was rtpd.cgi, which is a shell script that can be used to start and stop the real-time transport protocol daemon. So for example, if you wanted to stop the RTP daemon, you would simply send a request to rtpd.cgi, and in your query string you specify action equals stop to stop the service. The problem is the way they handle this query string that you provide is they replace all ampersands with spaces and then eval the result. So they're literally executing in a shell whatever you put in your query string. And not only that, it runs as root. So you can do something like this, and it reboots the device. And I actually had a hard time categorizing this because it's not even command injection. We're not injecting anything. It's just running whatever we give it. So I've dubbed this the Ron Burgundy because it will literally execute whatever you put in your query string. Not only will it execute what you put in your query string, but it'll send you the response back to your browser. So you can do something like this. This particular command will echo out the admin password. You get that sent back to your browser. And so you now have the admin password and access to the video feed. And so you're not only root, you're also admin. Now, as it turns out, D-Link, like many vendors, really likes to reuse code. And so this popped up in a lot of their products. But it didn't just affect D-Link because it was also used by TrendNet and several other off-brand devices as well. And due to the fact that there is so much reuse of this code within vendors and throughout different vendors, it turns out there's quite a few of them already publicly accessible and indexed by Shodan for you. Now, this vulnerability might sound familiar to some people, and that's because it probably is. Of course, after my talk got accepted, someone put a CVE out for this bug. So it's technically not an O-Day anymore. However, the CVE only addressed D-Link devices. It did not mention any of the other vendors affected. And the truth is, even if every single vendor put out a firmware update fixing this today, everyone would still be vulnerable like 3 years from now because no one updates firmware or even knows what it is half the time. So I expect this bug, even though it's technically not a no-day, to be quite useful for some time to come. So I said, okay, D-Link is an easy target. As I mentioned, that's why I picked them. Let's move on to perhaps a more reputable vendor like Cisco. The Cisco PVC-2300 is kind of a mid-range business IP camera. It runs about $500. Now, it too has a web server, and it enforces authentication by using HTTP password files, which most people are probably already familiar with. So basically, you put an HTTP password file, or more specifically, a symlink to a centralized HTTP password file, in every directory that you want to be password protected. So looking through the firmware, every single directory in the web interface had a .htp password file, except one. The OAMP directory did not have any HTTP password file. What it had was a bunch of XML files that were actually symlinks to this OAMP.cgi binary. So I said, okay, well, let's look at what this OAMP.cgi thing does. And as it turns out, it implements kind of its own little mini API that's totally separate from the rest of everything else running in the web interface. So it expects you, when you make a request to it, to specify an action. And this action you can specify, it can be one of many different things, including download configuration file, update firmware, and many others. But they weren't completely stupid. We'll get to the stupid stuff later, but they weren't completely stupid because what they do is before executing an action, they check to make sure that you've also provided a valid session ID. If you have not provided a valid session ID, the only action it lets you run is the login action. I said, okay, well, this in itself is interesting because they're implementing authentication that's totally separate from the authentication used everywhere else in the interface. So I started looking at how they actually handle this login action. They expect you to specify a username and a password. All right, so no surprises there. They then make 2 calls to this pro-get_stir function. Now, at this point, I have no idea what pro-get_stir does. Presumably, it gets a string of some sort. But I do know that on the first call to this function, they pass it 2 strings, OAMP and L1 user. And on the second call, they pass OAMP and L1 password. Now, the value returned for L1 user is then compared against the username that you provided. And the value returned for L1 password is compared against the password you provided. So presumably, this L1 user and L1 password, whatever their values are the correct login for this OAMP interface. Now, the only other place I could find in the firmware that actually referenced L1 user and L1 password was in the configuration file. These values are hard-coded in the device's running config under the OAMP section of the configuration file. You can see that L1 user is set to the string L1 underscore admin, and L1 password is set to the string L1 underscore 51. And this is a real problem because this whole OAMP interface and these hard-coded accounts are completely undocumented. So no one knows they're there except for people who bother to look at the firmware, which of course an admin is never going to do that. And even if an admin knew that these were here, there's no way for the admin to change this. There's no interface for the admin to go in and change these values. And the problem with having hard-coded secret passwords in your system and backdoors is that they don't stay secrets for long, right? So we can use these backdoor accounts to exercise the login action. And sure enough, we get back a session ID. Now, as long as we send the session ID along with all of our other requests, we can invoke any of the other actions supported by OAMP.cgi, including download configuration file. And this gives us back what appears to be base64 encoded data. The problem is if you try to base64 decode this, no worky. You just get a bunch of junk. The reason for that becomes readily apparent when you look at the actual encode 64 function in the binary itself. They are doing base64 encoding, but they're using a non-standard base64 key string. Luckily, it's very easy in Python to substitute the standard base64 key string in Python's base64 module with a custom key string like this. And so with a couple lines of Python, we can easily decode the config, which gives us plain text admin creds, which lets me see your server room. Now, the problem with viewing someone's server room is it's really exciting for like 10 seconds. And then you're like, holy shit, this is boring. So I went back and started looking at some more code, because that's more exciting. Now, the load firmware action is one of the other actions you can invoke. And it's actually very interesting because instead of uploading a firmware file to the device, you specify a URL. And then the device goes to that URL, downloads presumably the firmware, and then flashes it. The problem is that URL that you specify is shoved into a command line string that's ultimately passed to libc's system. And hopefully everyone here knows that taking unfiltered user supplied content and passing it to system is bad. You don't do it. So we can easily do command injection through this parameter. Just putting semicolon reboot semicolon somewhere in your URL reboots the machine. And of course we can run whatever command we want at this point. This also affects the WVC 2300. It's basically the same camera but with antennas. And there are hundreds of these cameras already out there online in hotels, obviously server rooms, and engineering companies who design things for the International Space Station, I'm told. So I said, okay, clearly D-Link and Cisco are doing it wrong. In their defense though, you know, they're not really camera companies. They don't do cameras. Cameras isn't really their focus. So let's look at someone who is a camera company. It's their bread and butter. Hopefully they know how to do it right. So I picked on IQ Envision, partially because they make some really expensive high definition cameras. The IQ 832N, for example, will run you over $1,000 a piece. So it's certainly not cheap. The main reason though is that these are the guys who make the cameras that are used in the business complex where I work. So it was a little more personal. And what you get for $1,000 per camera is a high definition video feed, unauthenticated, open to the world by default. Now, admittedly, this is a configurable option. You can require authentication. This is the default setting, but you can go in as an admin and change that. Now, guess how many admins connected their cameras to the internet without changing that default setting? Almost all of them. So this is really interesting, but it's not really that interesting from a security standpoint, right? It's like, oh, okay, they don't know how to secure their stuff. Big deal. But I wanted some actual vulnerabilities. So I said, well, let's look at getting into the admin area, which is password protected, and which thankfully most admins had the presence of mind to change the default settings for. So So to do this, I started looking at what else can I get to without authentication. And one of the few pages that you can get to without authentication is oidtable.cgi. And the output from oidtable really isn't that interesting. It's a bunch of technical camera settings like focus and all that other stuff. There's nothing really sensitive in here like usernames and passwords. What's more interesting is the code behind oidtable. Because if you disassemble this CGI binary, you'll see that it looks to see if you've specified a grep parameter in your query string when you send your GET request to it. Now, if you have, it checks to make sure the value you provided is less than 32 bytes long. And as long as you meet that requirement, it'll take that string, shove it into a grep command, and pass it to popen. At which case, I facepalmed, did my best Kim Jong-il impression, and did some command injection. And again, just like with the D-Link, you see I can run a PS command, and I get the output sent back to my browser. So I have a built-in, unauthenticated web root shell already on the device. It's also worth noting that while process listings are interesting, these cameras already have Netcat installed on them with the -E option enabled. So I'm sure most people here can think of some more interesting commands to run than a process listing. But my main goal in all this was really to get to the admin area, recall. So I said, well, how can I do that? Well, we can also use this bug to retrieve the contents of arbitrary files. Now, the etc priv password file is what contains the actual admin credentials. It's not an etc password, it's etc priv password. So we can pull back the contents of that file. And as you can see here, it has the username root and an encrypted password. So at this point, we have two options. You can try and decrypt the password, or if that doesn't work, I mean, screw it, we're root, we'll just overwrite the file with whatever we want. In either case, we get access to the admin area, and again, we're both root and admin on these cameras. These bugs affect most of IQ Envision's product line, including their 3 series cameras, the 7 series, the Sentinel series, the Alliance Pro, Alliance MX, and Alliance Mini series. I won't read off all the models, I'll be up here forever. And there are plenty of these out online, which is a little distressing considering that they're known to be deployed by schools, police, banks, governments, prisons, casinos, utility companies, financial consulting firms, and DHL, to name a few. So have fun with that. By far the most expensive camera I looked at, though, was the N5072 from 3S Vision. Now, this one has a list price of contact us, which is how I know I can afford it. And I ran into a bit of a problem with this particular camera. A little hiccup at first, because for all the other cameras, I had been able to just go to the vendor website, pull down a firmware update, whatever the latest firmware update was, and start analyzing the code and the firmware for vulnerabilities. So I really didn't have to buy the device in order to at least do initial testing and things like that. When I went to download the firmware for this camera, it gave me a little JavaScript pop-up box on the vendor's webpage saying, we want your password. So I immediately tried all the most common passwords, love, sex, God. Of course, none of those worked. What ended up working, though, was tab equals 4. Because if you look at the JavaScript, it sends your password back to the server. I don't even need to explain this to you guys. This is great. And as long as you get the password right, it just redirects you to your current URL with ampersand tab equals 4 appended onto the end of it. And I said, well, gee, since I'm literate and all, I bet I can do that myself. And sure enough, I get the download page. So this does not bode well for the security of their systems, nor does the fact that they're using a custom web server. It's rather innocuously named HTTPD, but if you actually just look at the strings in this binary, it's very clear that this is very custom to their firmware. It's either something that they rolled themselves from scratch or something that's been very heavily modified by them. So I said, well, if this looks really custom, I really need to start looking at how their web server handles authentication. Now, I know that the cameras use basic HTTP basic authentication, So I know that they're going to be doing some base64 decoding. Because if you're not familiar with HTTP basic auth, your username and password are basically concatenated and then base64 encoded. So I started looking through the code for cross-references to B64 decode. And so what they do when they decode your password is they pass it to B64 decode. All right, that's fine. They're decoding your stuff. They then do two string comparisons against a hard-coded string, 3S-admin, and another hard-coded string, 279888303. And I saw this and I thought, there is no way you were dumb enough to hard code stuff into your HTTP server. These can't possibly be creds. But they were, and they worked great. So you can access any 3S Vision camera, become admin with these backdoor creds, and that gives you access to video feeds of cache machines, Taiwanese checkpoints, and Russian industrial basements. At least that's what I assume that is. Now again, looking at video feeds is really boring, so I wanted root. Luckily their code is littered, especially once you're logged in as admin, your attack surface is wide open. And their code is just littered with unsafe function calls. It's absolutely horrible. Probably the best example of this is their records.cgi handler. Now, not all of the cameras, but many of their cameras support local storage. So you can plug in, say, an SD card to the camera, and it'll save files off to the SD card for you. So they also provide a way to do some basic file management from the admin interface. And this is done through the records.cgi page. Now, records.cgi is not a physical CGI page sitting on disk. What happens is when the web server sees that you requested records.cgi, and it invokes the doRecords function handler. So the doRecords function handler checks to see what action you've provided. So for example, if you wanted to delete a file, you can tell it action equals remove. Now if you're deleting a file, you also have to tell it which file you want deleted. So it checks to make sure that you've specified a file name as well. That file name is then shoved into an RM command that is passed to system. And I think everyone knows where this is going, yeah. Setting file name equals backtick reboot backtick makes it not respond to pings anymore. Now this affects almost all of 3S Vision's product line, not only the cameras, but also their video servers, because they use the same web server as well. And after a bit of research, I found that another company named A-Linking used the same code in their cameras as well. Now, A-Linking went through and changed the hard-coded creds to something else. So they still had, all the A-Linking cameras have the same hard-coded creds, they're just different from 3S Vision's hard-coded creds. And I'll leave finding those as an exercise to the reader, but they're there and they're easy to find. Now these cameras are particularly interesting due to their cost. There's not a whole lot of them, when compared to some of the other devices. But considering that these cameras are known to be deployed in foreign military, energy, and industrial facilities, they're particularly interesting. So all of you who are already looking these up on Shodan, be careful. Don't blame me when the Chinese military shows up and gets pissed at you. So what this all boils down to is I'm in your network, I can see you, and I'm root, which is not a bad position for any attacker to be in. Most of these cameras, the way that they're deployed, they're actually connected to the internal network. So if you can remotely access them and break into them, get root on them, you now have a Linux-based ARM machine sitting inside their network that you can then use to go after anything else in the network. But I wanted to kind of take a step back from that and say, okay, that's great and all, but what can I do to the camera itself? All right, I've got root on the camera. This is awesome. But if you go up to an average admin and say, I got root on your camera, he's like, I don't even know what that means, right? What the hell are you talking about? So I wanted to do something a little more interesting, something that would actually demonstrate what you can do. So, skipping slides. I wanted to take, say, a video stream that looks like this, and instead make it look like this. And this is kind of the classic Hollywood hack, right? You've got to get into the facility that's guarded and it's got security cameras, so the token hacker of the group has to break into this camera system and make it look like no one's there when really they are. So to demonstrate this and just do a little proof of concept, I picked a TrendNet IP410WN. Now, I picked this camera for a couple reasons. First of all, I can afford it, which is a big plus. But secondly, it has a backdoor account that can access certain restricted files, which have very obvious command injection bugs, which can be trivially exploited by anyone who can send packets to the camera. In other words, it's the same stuff I've been up here talking about the whole time, just on a slightly less expensive camera. Now, as it turns out, this particular bug is also not a Node A. It was actually first published in 2011. The problem is, I didn't know about it, and neither did anyone else, because when they published this, they didn't mention any specific devices that were affected. They didn't mention any specific firmware versions that were affected. So if you went and Googled for, TV IP410WN vulnerabilities or exploits, you didn't find anything. And the problem with not providing this information when you do things like vulnerability reports is it's difficult for other people in the security community to validate your claims, first of all. But it also makes it impossible for vendors and customers to determine what models need to be fixed and whether I'm actually vulnerable or not. So the easiest solution here is to just ignore it and hope it goes away, which is what everyone did. So these devices, even though this is a known bug since 2011, have been shipping with these bugs ever since. Oh yeah, there's a lot of them out there too. So let's say hypothetically this is our admin's video feed. We want to make sure it stays that way, right? So for purposes of demonstration, we'll assume that the admin is browsing the video feed through the web interface rather than maybe through a custom service or RTPD or something like that. So if you're on this particular camera, when you're browsing, when you're viewing the video feed through your browser, the process responsible for streaming images to your browser is mjpeg.cgi. So with command injection and the ability to see the output from our commands that we're injecting, we can run process lists and see what processes are running, and then we can just kill off all the mjpeg.cgi processes. And this actually has the effect of temporarily freezing the admin's video feed, because his browser is only going to show him whatever the last image it received was, and he's no longer getting any more images. But we don't want to stop there, because if the admin refreshes his browser or navigates away from the page and comes back, he starts up a new stream and then he's going to see the live video feed. So what we also want to do is replace mjpeg.cgi. And this does not have to be difficult. A 2-line bash script will suffice, particularly in a pinch. All you have to do is replace this CGI page on disk with a bash script that echoes out some basic headers to make the browser happy, and then cats out the contents of its static JPEG image. Presumably, this JPEG is a picture of the empty elevator, but it can be goatse or whatever you want. So while the admin will now always see this, no matter what is actually going on in the elevator. So this is actually a lot more fun to see in a live demo. So if the demo gods will work with me today. All right, so I have my camera guarding my precious beer here, so you can see if I try and take it, whoever's watching will know. However, I have a little exploit script written up, and this exploit script does a couple of things. First of all, it's going to kill the admin's video feed. It's going to replace the mjpeg.cgi just like we showed. It's also going to give me the administrative credentials to the camera and set up a secret URL so that I can still see the live video feed even though the admin's is frozen permanently. So sending exploit. Okay, so you can see here it gave me back the user credentials. The login is admin and securecam1234. It also tells me what URL it's set up so that I can view the real video feed. So if I go over to my hacker's browser here, See if I can type this. I can see what's going on. So if I try and take this, I know that, but the admin doesn't. So that's the demo. So a couple closing thoughts I'd like to leave you with. First of all, this clearly is not an all-encompassing list of bugs in security cameras, not by a long shot. So there's lots more of these to be found if you want to go look for them yourself. And as you've seen, most of them are epically trivial to exploit. Another thing I'd like to point out is that almost all of these cameras will reveal their model name even if you're not authenticated, either on the login page or the login prompt, depending on how they're doing authentication. It'll tell you what its model number is. So if I, as an attacker, know the model number, even if I know nothing else about this camera, I can go on Google, I can Google the model number, go to the vendor's webpage, download the firmware, maybe have to add, tab equals 4, get the firmware and start analyzing it for vulnerabilities without ever even having to buy the device. And this is exactly what I did with all of these cameras. I was able to find the vulnerabilities and write working exploits without ever having to buy a single camera. It was all done with firmware analysis, basically using binwalk to do firmware analysis and extraction, and then using IDA and QEMU for disassembly and emulation if necessary. So with that, now I know when I open up for Q&A, like half the room always leaves. So before you head out, please fill out the surveys or swipe your badge for surveys or however that works in the back. But with that, I'll open up for any questions you guys might have. Oh, got one.
Do you run into any actually secure cameras?
No. So there were a lot more cameras that I looked at. I didn't need like a 2-hour slot to talk about all of them. I did not run into one that was actually well done and actually secure. Now, with that said, there are a lot of larger vendors that I simply didn't have the resources to look at. They don't put their firmware up for free, and I don't have the money to buy their cameras, right? So I'm not saying there aren't secure cameras out there, but the ones I've looked at, certainly not. Anyone else? Oh. You have to speak up. I can't hear you. Mm-hmm. So the easiest way to do that in this case would be like an animated GIF, which is, a really pretty hacky workaround. Certainly this can be taken a lot farther. Yeah, I mean, you could easily write your own CGI that really does feed a live video of whatever you want. I'm lazy though, and that was my demo. But the concept's the same. You're root on these devices, you can do whatever you want. Yeah, you can certainly do that. That it? Oh.